Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Listen with Vobes. I'm Richard Vobes. We're live here in Worthing, beaming out to wherever you are. It's good to have you with me today on Tuesday, and what a glorious sunny day it is, I have to say. As ever, we're continuing with our story Listen with Vobes by Norman Collins, and a terrific read it's been so far. I'm thoroughly enjoying it, and I hope you are. So we're going to spend another hour or just under, depending on, with this remarkable book that was published in 1945 but set in 1938. Already we have lots of people out there eager to hear the story, so thank you for coming back and joining me this afternoon. Say hello to the lovely Julia, to Turbo Stream, to Holly and Co, to Sensible Paul, who says good afternoon. Got in from cutting the grass on my knees. What are you doing? Using scissors. And Tall Podge Rog is there. He says hot and sunny in Guildford, which is very nice. And he says sitting about in shorts. Excellent. I wish I had my shorts on. Justine Jones says I'll be listening while I'm doing the ironing. And Audrey Forbes is also with us, and Jen Colley. Sensible Paul, I've already said. Zom Coco, hello everybody. Davy Vad, what a scorcher it certainly is. The reason I got my Mary Hammond jumper on is it's cold in my back room, and especially when you come in. I was just sitting outside having a cup of tea before we started, and it was lovely and warm, and I just had my shirt on. And I got inside and I went, oh, blimey, it feels cold in the house compared to outside. Philip Hammond and Mary are there. They're sitting in the sunshine. Mary is knitting away. Turbo Stream is there. I've just said that. Linda Kane, good afternoon. First meet up with friends since before Christmas. Blimey. Oh, that's nice. Nice to do that. Michael White and H and Lee Lawson. Hello, asleep again, just woken up in time. Sleep in the afternoon, eh? God, it's all right for some. I've just spent 7 hours working on tomorrow's video. 7 hours, yeah, well, some of them need that extra bit of work. It's because I'm in it. I don't have the luxury of having the lovely Julia in this one. But never mind. We're on chapter 24, ladies and gentlemen. 24. What will be going on? Who knows? Are we all ready to get on? It's 4 o'clock there and you're all here, so let's crack on. Chapter 24. Mr. Josser had been in bed all this time. Ever since his soaking, he had been up and down, better one day and worse the next. And this evening, Mrs. Josser didn't like the look of him at all. He had a pain in his side every time he breathed, and his temperature was mounting again. Taken altogether, it had been the most trying 3 weeks that she could remember. Almost like flattening the curve and waiting for COVID to go, but not quite as trying as that. With Mr. Josser more peevish than she had ever known him. And then, on top of everything, the regular panel doctor had to choose this of all times to go off on holiday. And Mr. Josser refused point blank to see his locum tenens. Not that Mrs. Josser blamed him. The locum tenens was a woman. About 9:30, when Mr. Josser was breathing 19 to the dozen and groaning with every lungful, Mrs. Josser could stand the strain no longer. She arranged for Mrs. Boone to sit with the invalid while she slipped outside for a moment, and she phoned up Doris. It was the first telephone call from her family that Doris had received. "But, my sweet, you can't think of going now," Doreen said when she told her. "Not with all those sandwiches to eat. You simply can't. And you know how alarming everything always sounds over the phone. It's probably nothing, really." She was speaking at the top of her voice because she was excited, but she was also annoyed. The first time they'd ever had anyone to the flat, something like this always happened to Doris. At the present moment there were 8 cheerful young men in the room, which in itself was something of a scoop with so much competition about. And when the phone started ringing, she thought it was going to be the 9th, explaining why he wasn't there already. In fact, she'd gone over to the instrument expecting Mr. Purkis, and had found Mrs. Josser instead. "I think I ought to go," Doris said quietly. Doreen leant over and grabbed Billy by the arm. She had to do something to attract his attention. He'd been taking no notice of her all evening. "Tell her it isn't anything to worry about," she said. "Tell her she's just getting panicky." Bill thought for a moment. "Shouldn't think it's serious," he replied at last. "But it might be. You can't tell without seeing him." He paused and looked across at Doris. "She better go if she wants to. There's no harm finding out." Doreen dropped Bill's arm again. "I think it's monstrous," she said, "trailing across London at this time of night, simply because someone phones." She was speaking louder than ever now. Her colour was higher too. She seemed to be in danger of bursting into tears at any moment. Then somebody behind her, it was Clifford, the one who could do Hitler, and was a perfect scream with his imitations, put his arm around her waist and pulled her back down onto the settee beside him. "You still have me," he said, in his Boyer voice. "Take life by the throat, little girl. Don't be afraid of love." Doris had gone out of the room by now, simply walked through into the bedroom and left them there. And a moment later she came back. She'd got her handbag under her arm. "Please don't anybody move," she said. "I'm terribly sorry for breaking up everything like this." She'd got halfway through to the door. Then suddenly Doreen jumped up and flung her arms around her neck. "I've been a pig," she said. "An absolute pig. Of course you must go if you're worried. We all understand." But she'd spoken a moment too soon, for Bill had got up too and was standing staring at Doris again. "I'll come with you," he said. It was touch and go for a moment, but Doreen realised that she mustn't lose her temper in front of all these people. So she gave a little laugh instead. "Now I understand," she said. "It's just a blind for you it's just a blind for you two to get off together." "No, it isn't," said Bill. "I only just thought of it." But Doris was already in the tiny hall, opening the yellow front door. On the way down, together, they met Mr. Purkis, tolling up the iron staircase. He was carrying a bottle of scotch and a bunch of dark red roses. His patent leather shoes twinkled, but he was obviously out of condition. By the time he reached them, his mouth was hanging wide open. As soon as he saw Doris, however, he threw himself up and tried to look a youngster who had just come bounding up the whole flight. "My dear young lady," he said, "not going, not leaving your own party?" "My father's ill." "Oh, sorry, her father's ill," Bill told him. "She's just going over to see him." "Oh, and a very charming visitor for a sick man to have," Mr. Purkis replied. "I only hope that if I should ever be ill—" "Good night," said Bill, who didn't like Mr. Purkis. "I feel awful dragging you away like this." It was the dozenth time that she'd said it ever since they'd left the flat, and Bill made his usual answer. "My idea entirely," he said. "Just thought I'd like the ride." They were nearly there at last. The sun had gone out of the sky by now and was setting amid the smoke of Hammersmith. The whole western quarter of London seemed to be ablaze, and the windows of Whitehall glittered back at it. Ahead of them, Westminster had caught the glare and was shining. Then, when they came to the bridge, they saw the river on fire, a great flaming tide flowing seawards under their feet. The walls of the embankment had turned from grey to pink and were smouldering, and little burning wisps carried high into the air sparkled from the tops of railings and lampposts. St. Paul's itself carried a lighted faggot shape, like a cross on a summit. Bill surveyed the scene for a moment in silence. "Gonna be a fine day tomorrow," he said. There was a pause. "You better get the bus back from the Oval," Doris suggested. "We're not there yet," Bill answered. There was something obstinately faithful about him. It was a following, dog-like quality. He was clearly determined not to allow Doris out of his sight if he could help it. In consequence, there was quite a scene outside the Roebuck when the bus put them down there. Boris wanted Bill to go back, and Bill wanted to go on. "Can't drag a chap all this way and then send him home again," he kept saying. "'Tisn't good enough." The trouble was that Doris couldn't explain why she didn't want him. There were two reasons. In the first place, she was worried about her father, and second, she was worried about her mother. She planned to take Bill over sometime, and she had planned to take Bill over sometime, and she didn't want him dropping in unannounced like this when everything was bound to be upset anyhow. She hadn't forgotten that awful evening when Doreen had paid a visit to her at Dulcimer Street. Dulcimer Street itself looked unusually drab and shabby when they got there. Now that the commotion of the sunset was over and done with, the whole of London was glowing no longer. It was grey, and the south of the river greyness seemed thicker and more opaque. There was none of the pearly greyness of early morning about it. It was flat, a dirty grey that seemed compounded of equal degrees of soot, nightfall, and the littleness of man's ambition. After the clear air of Primrose Hill, it was too abrupt, this descent into gathering darkness of the London jungle. They had reached the house by now, and Doris suddenly repented. She held out her hand to him. "It was ever so sweet of you to come with me," she said. "It was, really. I'm sorry I was cross." "Hadn't I better come in and see if I can do anything?" Bill inquired, hopefully. "A bit of a medical advice and all that." Doris shook her head. "Some other time," she said. "Not now. Mother's sure to be worried." Bill remained there in silence for a moment. The faithful dog-like expression was more noticeable than ever. Then something crossed his mind. He gave a little grin, a mere tremor of a tail, as it were, and then thrust his hands into his pockets. "Tell you what," he said, "I'll just wait outside, in case I'm needed. That way, if you want something from the chemist, give me 1/4 of an hour and I'll have it sent to you." Sorry, I read that wrong. "I'll give you 1/4 of an hour, and then if you haven't sent for me, I'll go home." "Good night, Bill," she said to him. "Good night, Doris." "He's asleep at the moment," Mrs. Josser was saying. "Just dropped off before you got here." "But how is he?" Doris asked. Mrs. Josser drew her breath. "Not himself," she answered. "He doesn't complain much because he isn't that sort, but he's not himself. You can see for yourself he isn't." Just as they reached the bottom door, Mrs. Josser laid her hand on Doris's arm. "Try and get him to see the doctor," she said. "I've been on at him all day. He may take more notice of you." Mr. Josser was awake again by the time Doris got into the bedroom. He was propped up by so many pillows that he seemed almost to be leaning forwards. And there was something anxious and staring, frightened even, about him. His eyes were scared, and across his forehead the beads of perspiration were standing out. "Doris," he said faintly, "what are you doing here?" "How are you, Dad?" she asked, trying to keep her voice level and casual sounding. She went over to the bed and bent down. His face felt rough and burning as she kissed him. And as Mr. Josser raised his lips to her, she was aware of something oddly disturbing about it. His kiss was at once passionate and feeble. It was as though he had been carefully saving up just enough strength for one kiss, for that one kiss. And even then, found that it was too much for him. The kiss died away before it could come to anything. Then Mr. Josser smiled. The old, frightened look disappeared for a moment on his face, and then it returned. "Just me old chess playing up again," he said. "Something wrong with the bellows." Because he felt that it was expected of him in front of Mrs. Josser, he attempted a little laugh as well as a smile. But that was a mistake. It made him cough, and it was a violently painful cough. He held his hand to his side as though he'd been wounded. When he'd recovered, the beads of sweat on his forehead were reinforced with new ones. "That's the second time this evening," Mrs. Josser reported. "He was like this earlier." I'm all right if I sit up," Mr. Josser assured them. "It's only that it catches me sometimes." "Hadn't we better get a doctor?" Dorian asked him. Mr. Josser shook his head. "Not tonight," he said. "Not as late as this. Wait till Doctor—" "But you've got a temperature," Doris told him. "You're ever so hot." She was fondling his hand as she spoke. It was a dry, rasping sort of hand. We've had all that out earlier," Mrs. Josser said grimly. "I tried to take it, but he wouldn't let me." Mr. Josser looked from one to the other imploringly. "It's nothing," he explained with a little gasp in between the words. "Just being shut up in this room all day." As he finished, Doris got up and faced him. "Well, I think it's something," she said. "You've got to see a doctor, and I'm going for him." Mr. Josser roused himself a moment and then tried to stop, but the pain in his side was too sharp and he had to sit quiet again. He muttered something about a lot of women fussing over him. Mrs. Josser turned to Doris. "You go right along," she said, "and don't come back without one." "Oh, don't come back without." "You go right along," she said, "and don't come back without one." No NHS back then, says Audrey Forbes. Quite right. 2. 2. I'm saying 2 because it's the next section in the book. I don't normally read that bit out, but it's the next little bit. From behind the long, hanging curtain in the front room, Percy stood staring down through his squint into the roadway below. He had seen it twice already, and as he waited, he saw it again. A young man, a heavily built young man in flannel trousers and a sports coat, was patrolling up and down outside the house, going 2 doors in one direction and then turning and going 2 doors in the other direction. Every time he paused, the street lamp outside lit him up like an actor on the stage. "That's them," he said, helplessly. "They're watching me. They're playing cat and mouse. That's what they're doing. Cat and mouse. They know it's me, and they're waiting. There'll be someone there all night just to make sure of me. And when they are ready, they'll pounce. That's them, watching me." Because it's actually Bill waiting outside, isn't it? It suddenly just dawned on me. That's Bill that he sees. That's Percy, obviously. Bill was still there when Doris got back down to the street again. He had a manner of someone who was prepared, if necessary, to stop until morning. Even so, he didn't seem surprised when Doris came up to him. "Want some throat lozenges?" he asked, cheerfully. But Doris wasn't a bit cheerful. "Oh, Bill," she said, "I'm worried. I've got to get a doctor, quick." "Me come too," Bill said, and fell into step alongside her. "What's wrong?" he asked. I don't know," Doris answered him. "I think it's pneumonia or something." "Who's your doctor?" Bill asked. "Oh, he's away or something," Doris told him. "I'm just going to get the first one I can find." "What about me?" Bill suggested. "Yeah, but you're not qualified." "I'm as good as." Doris paused. "Would you know what to do?" she asked him. "Well, can't unless I see him," he said. "Better let me have a look." He took hold of Doris's arm as she spoke and steered her back round in the direction of the house. "Nothing to worry about in pneumonia nowadays," he assured her. M and B'll fix him." Bill took a bit of explaining to Mrs. Josser when they got back. He didn't look at least like any doctor they'd ever seen. The whole thing seemed a bit like a put-up job to her, and she remained suspicious and unconvinced. But as Doris had brought him straight into the bedroom, there wasn't much she could do about it. What's more, Bill had taken matters into his own hands. He was over by the bed talking to Mr. Josser. The two of them seemed to have developed a rapid and intimate friendship. They were whispering together, and Bill was doing something to the top button of Mr. Josser's pyjama jacket. This only made things worse in Mrs. Josser's eyes. She had always regretted her husband's readiness to make friends with anyone. First of all Percy, and now this strange man with the baggy flannel trousers and the extraordinary tie. When Bill had lifted Mr. Josser's pink and white pyjamas, he got round behind him and pressed his ear against his back. As he did so, Doris noticed how thin her father was. His backbone made a hard, knobbly ridge with the hot skin stretched over it. "Just take a breath as far as it'll go," Bill was saying. "Don't strain at all." Mr. Josser drew in his breath and winced as he did so. "Ah," Bill said approvingly, as though the pain had been his own idea. "Do it again." Mr. Josser sucked in the air again. His mouth was hanging open slightly all the time from the strain of breathing, and again he winced before his lungs were half full. "That'll do for now," Bill said. But he hadn't finished. Laying his hand on Mr. Josser's back, he began percussing him. There was an intent, an absorbed look on his face that Doris had not seen before. He seemed, for the moment, someone apart from the rest of them, someone remote and vastly important. When he had done, he tucked in Mr. Josser's pyjamas carefully around as if they were arranging a baby, and wiped his hands, which were sticky. Then he stepped back. "You just sit up and enjoy yourself," he said, "and I'll tell you what's the matter with you." Is it bad?" Mr. Josser asked. She caught. "Oh, sorry, that was Mrs. Josser. Is it bad?" Mrs. Josser asked. She caught Mr. Josser's eye as she said it and looked away as if ashamed of herself for asking. "Not if we do something about it," Bill told her. You've got a touch of pleurisy. That's all it is. You better let me do a bit of paracensis, or whatever that is." "What's that?" Mr. Josser demanded. "Just tap the left lung and let the fluid out. That's what's causing the pain." But it's not as easy as all that. Mrs. Josser came over to Bill and stood in front of him. "Are you qualified, young man?" she asked. Bill paused and hoped that Doreen wasn't going to say anything. "Yes," he answered. Mrs. Josser was still obviously dubious, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she went across to the bed and began stroking Mr. Josser's forehead. "Don't worry, Fred," she told him. "You'll be all right." There was something protective in her attitude, as though she was defending him from any rash assault that Doris's young man might attempt on him. And Bill took advantage of it. "Yes, that's right," he said. "Keep the patient comfortable while I go and collect my bag. Back again inside half an hour. Not too much excitement, mind." Outside the door, Doris caught hold of Bill's arm. "Oh, Bill, are you sure you can do it?" she said. "Are you certain he'll be all right?" And because it was dark on the landing and because she was close to him, he kissed her. It was a rapid, clumsy sort of kiss, a kiss hastily inserted into the momentous business of the evening. She followed him downstairs without speaking. "Don't get run over, Bill," she told him. In the end, he was away for nearly an hour. First, he tried to find a friend at St. Thomas's, which was near, but the friend was away somewhere. Then he tried the Westminster, where he vaguely knew the house surgeon, but the house surgeon was unimpressed by the whole proposal. He recommended calling in another doctor and rang off. So there was nothing to do there was nothing for it but to go right over to Charing Cross, where he belonged. And there was a night sister who gave him what he needed. She was calm, sensible sort of woman. "And if anything goes wrong, don't forget that you came in and took the things when my back was turned," she said. "I don't want to go losing my job because of you." Bill smiled at her. "Sister," he said, "I'll make you a matron one day. And now, have you got an attaché case or something? I can't walk about London looking like an emergency." He blued 2 shillings on a cab on the way back, and Doris was waiting for him down in the street when he got there. "Oh, Bill," she said, "do hurry. He looks so awful." When Bill had got on his long white coat, Mrs. Josser seemed more ready to believe him. By now, Bill had ceased to take any real notice of her. That was the intent, absorbed look on his face again. He asked for saucepans of water and stood there impatiently while it was brought to him. And then, without asking Mrs. Josser's permission, he lit the gas ring by the fireplace and placed a saucepan on it. Then he unpacked his case, thoughtfully counting out the contents. 1 hypodermic, he was saying to himself, 1 bottle of iodine, 1 packet of swabs, 1 pump suction, 1 vacuum jar, 1 bottle Novocaine, 1 trocar, 1 pair of surgical forceps. He took up the hypodermic syringe in the forceps. It was noticeable that there was a kind of expert daintiness about him now, quite unusual to his normal clumsiness, and he lowered it into the saucepan. Then again, without asking permission, he went over to the wash basin and started scrubbing his hands. He looked more professional still as he stood there, and he was certainly more authoritative. He turned to Mrs. Josser. "You look tired," he said. "Just go and sit down and leave me and Doris here." Mrs. Josser pursed her lips. "I'm stopping here," she said. "Oh, in that case, perhaps you could give me a couple of clean towels," he asked. "Just to save on the sheets, you know." He went to the bed and stood over Mr. Josser. "Do you mind sitting round this way a bit?" he asked. "The light's better." Then he beckoned to Doris. "Come over here," he said. "I want you to hold things." Mr. Josser vaguely tried to protest. Leave it to the morning," he began. "I don't want Doris to have to—" "Quiet, please," Bill told him. "This won't hurt. It's only iodine." He felt Mr. Josser's back like a masseur, and just below the point of the shoulder blade, where the thin back fell in again, he painted a little medallion with the iodine. It stood out startlingly bright on his pale flesh, like dark blood, and Doris wondered suddenly if she was going to faint. Then Bill returned with the hypodermic syringe and filled it with a little bottle. "This'll just be a little prick," he said. "You'll hardly feel it." And pinching up the skin between his thumb and forefinger, he thrust in the needle. "Did it hurt?" Bill asked. Mr. Josser shook his head gratefully. "And the rest's easy," Bill went on. He took up the forceps again and went over to the saucepan where the aspirating syringe was being boiled. This syringe was an altogether bigger and more formidable affair than the first one. It had a needle like a dagger. It seemed impossible that Mr. Josser could endure having that thrust into him. Bill caught Doris's eye. "Can't hurt," he said, understandingly. I've given him a shot of something." He prodded the dark medallion with the point of the needle and waited for Mr. Josser to complain. Mr. Josser, however, continued to sit there, staring in the direction of the fireplace, unnoticing. Then, spreading out the skin between the first 2 fingers of his left hand, Bill thrust the needle right home. There was something brutally deliberate about the whole performance. A severe professionalism had set in, and it was obvious that the idea of sensitive, protesting flesh didn't concern him in the least. All that he had in mind was the needle and the way he wanted it to go. This time there was nothing in the syringe when the little circle of brown skin was punctured, but as Bill drew back the plunger, the small glass cylinder became filled with straw-coloured fluid. It was as though the tip of the hollow needle had somehow landed in a pot of freshly brewed weak tea. Bill said, "Ah." It was, as remarks go, thoroughly unrevealing and non-committal, but at the same time it was involuntary. It confirmed what for the past hour Bill had been doubting, that there was any fluid there at all. He now felt himself a wizard among diagnosticians, and he got ready for the next part of the operation. First of all, he removed the syringe altogether. Then he crossed over again to his conjurer's table and came back with a large jam jar-looking thing filled with taps and little lengths of rubber tubing attached to one end of them, and a still larger syringe. And there was more to it than that. He had a small suction pump in his hand as well. It was a chunky, solid piece of work that might have belonged to a garage or a workshop. Bill gave one or two vague sucks at the air with it to satisfy himself that the instrument was working properly, and then he attached it to the spare tap on the jam jar and began to pump the air out. He gave 12 strokes and the thing was ready. There was now 40 pounds of pressure in the jar, and it was going to be applied to the inside of Mr. Josser's lungs. "Can you pass me the jar?" he asked Doris. He reached out his hand without even looking at her, and Doris passed the suction jar without looking at Mr. Josser's back. She felt sick. Very sick. She'd seen enough. She was dimly aware that Bill was connecting a dangling piece of tubing to the tap on the jam jar. The piece of tubing was connected to her father. Then Bill turned the other tap ever so little, and a bit more of the same straw-like fluid came splashing into the jar. The level in the jar surged up, leaving a little scum of froth on the sides. Bill adjusted the tap, and the rush dwindled to a trickle. Doris glanced across at Bill. He had eased his bent back a little and was resting the jar on the folded-up pillow. "This is where we can take it easy," he said. "This takes time." He put the spare hand on Mr. Josser's shoulder. "You'll feel better almost in a minute now." Then he looked round at Doris. "Take her to the other room," he said to Mrs. Josser, "and tell her to sit with her head between her... Take her to the other room," he said to Mrs. Josser, "and tell her to sit with her head between her legs for a bit. Then she'll feel better too." It was 2:30 in the morning now, and Bill was sitting propped up in one of the two armchairs in the Jossers' front room, with his feet up on the other one. He had Doris's coat across his knees, and not because he was cold, but for quite another reason. He'd pulled it up to his chin and rubbed his cheek against it. 3 pints of fluid, no cardiac collapse, patient breathing comfortably, and I shall see Doris at breakfast, he was telling himself sleepily. My goodness, how about that? How about that? Well, that's cracking, wasn't it? Blimey. Whew. Don't worry, Linda. He's not going to quit. He's not going to take his eye out. He's not taking his eye out. Blimey. What about that, hey? We are on chapter 25 now, ladies and gentlemen. I enjoyed that. I very much enjoyed that. Good old Bill. Let me have a quick swig of water. Swig. No problem here. I've seen it done many times, says Anne H. Oh, really? He needs some fun music to play as an intro. What are you on about? Snipers on the borders. Okay. Sometimes I think you're listening to a completely different book and you just happen to be chatting in this same thing. It's most peculiar. Anyway, Connie had just had the thrill of her life, and all of it through the crack in her bedroom door, which had just happened to be ajar at the right moment. She liked having her door a bit open because it kept her in touch with whatever else was going on in the house. Even if she herself was less private, there were recompenses. Like this afternoon, for instance. She'd heard one of the doors on the floor below open and shut itself, and she thought that it was Mrs. Josser pottering about at something. But as soon as she listened to the footsteps, she knew that it wasn't Mrs. Josser. They weren't even a woman's, so they must belong, she realised, to Mr. Todd's, the dull, hard-working young man who was on night shift at the power station. There was no rule, so far as she knew, why he shouldn't move about his own house if he wanted to, but a sixth sense, a kind of supernatural hunch, told her there was something unusual going on. And when she heard the footsteps ascend the stairs instead of going down them, she felt sure that he was up to something. Very neatly, she hid herself behind the curtain. The footsteps, was she only imagining it, or did they really sound muffled, came up the stairs and paused for a moment outside the door, actually paused there as though Mr. Todd's was going to pay her a visit. But he didn't come in, he just stood there. And Connie could almost hear him doing nothing. She remained quiet. As she remained quite still where she was, behind the thick curtain with the red plush pile hanging in folds all around her. Then she heard her name called, and it was called twice, quite distinctly. "Miss Coke, are you there? Miss Coke, is anyone about?" But it was called so softly that she knew that she wasn't meant to answer, knew that nobody was meant to answer, and in any case she couldn't very well come out now. She didn't want Mr. Nobby Night Shift, whatever he was up to, imagining she spent her time playing peep-bow with herself behind the curtain. And it was just as she had expected. When she didn't answer, he went on. It was perfectly plain that he had never had the slightest intention of coming in now. Mrs. Boone was the door he was really making for. Mrs. Boone's was the door he was really making for, and when he reached it, he knocked quite openly and stood there waiting as if expecting someone to open it for him. But it was a very subdued kind of knock. The kind of knock that you wouldn't hear unless you were actually inside the room or straining your ears to listen, like Connie. And that wasn't all. Wasn't even the most important part. The big interest, the real hanky-panky stuff, came now. She heard Mr. Todd's knock a second time, and then she heard him open the door and close it again. He was still standing on the landing, and it was obvious that he had simply stuck his head in the room to see for himself. After a moment, she heard him move across to the other door, Percy's door, and the same performance went on. He knocked, waited, knocked again, and then looked inside. Risking everything, Connie struck her head round the fringe of the curtain and took a peep. She was just in time to see Percy's door closing. Mr. Todd's sneak thief was inside. As soon as he got into the room, Mr. Todd's turned the key in the lock behind him and got busy. He began straight away searching through the things in the cupboards, in the hanging places for clothes behind the bit of creatine, I don't know what, creatone or something, in the dressing table. He was very quick and expert about it, but somehow not in the least hurried. He took as long as he wanted to take to take about everything. When he was examining Percy's clothes, for instance, he first of all ran his eye rapidly along a lot of them, like a second-hand wardrobe dealer, and then he felt them over to see if there was anything in any of the pockets, and finally he carried one pair of trousers over to the window to see them by better light. It was the same when he came to the dressing table. He was so cool that he might have been rummaging through other people's drawers all his life. He inspected everything, the jumble of fancy ties, the bottles of hair lotion, the steel and spring chest expanders, the packet of art photographs taken away, the packet of art photographs hidden away at the back, and he evidently didn't think anything of any of them. It wasn't until he got down to the second drawer that the quiet Mr Todd's, the borough servant with the good references, came on something that took his fancy. And that was the blue glass lady from the radiator of the hot Bentley. It was love at first sight. He grasped it, handled it lovingly, and held it up to the window so that the light shone through the robes and seemed to kindle them. Then, without pausing for a second to consider whether it was wrong or not, whether it was stealing, he thrust the head downwards into his side pocket and went on poking about. There was something else in the drawer below that interested him just as much, and that was the pair of silver coach lamps that Percy had removed and kept. Mr Todd took them up and inspected them. Evidently, like Percy, he had a taste for expensive knick-knacks, but he didn't keep the coach lamps. After he'd finished fondling them, he put them back again. Even after he'd been right through the dressing table, drawer by drawer, he wasn't satisfied. He went over to Percy's raincoat, which hung on a hook all by itself by the washstand, and thrust his hands into the pocket. He found one oddment that made him pause, and that was Percy's cosh. He evidently liked it almost as much as he liked the blue glass lady. Because one or two of the ties with it were because after one or two tries with it in the empty air, just to see how heavy it was, he pinched that too. Finally, with one last quick look round to make sure that he hadn't left anything out of place, he leaned his weight against the door so that the catch would come back quietly. It was obviously that he knew all the tricks, turned the key in the lock, and stood there listening for a moment. When he didn't hear a sound, he opened the door a crack and listened again. There was still silence. That was good enough. Without more ado, he stepped out, closed the door behind him, and went downstairs. Smart, eh? Smart nothing. He hadn't even worn gloves. There were fingerprints everywhere for anyone who was looking for them, and, though of course he didn't know it, there was Connie behind the curtain, watching him as he came out onto the landing. She was nearly swooning from the suspense. When Mr Todd's own door, the only door that he had any right to open, had closed after him, Connie came out of her hiding place. She was hugging herself with excitement. To have a sneak thief under one's roof was a piece of luck that didn't come to everybody. And to be right on top of him, that was the real fun. At the beginning, too. It might lead anywhere, even in the police court, with Connie in the witness box instead of the dock, and the beak congratulating her on having caught the man red-handed. She turned a number of schemes over in her mind, and then chose the simplest. She got a handbag, and taking out sixpence, it was lucky that she should have happened in a week that she could spare it, she went over to the light and scratched a cross in the middle of Her Majesty's right cheek. Then she laid the sixpence scratch downwards on the mantelpiece and left it there. There was nothing like marked money for trapping smarties. "You whistle, Dukey boy, if anyone comes for it," she said. You whistle, Dukey boy, if anyone comes for it," she said to the canary. Not that she really liked leaving her room wide open for Mr Todd's to prowl in. He was the sort of easy he was the sort of easy fingers who wasn't above pilfering from people like the Boones. How did she know that her own pink satin shoes would be safe? She was in no doubt about what the Boones had in their rooms, because she had taken the liberty of having a little innocent look around once or twice herself, when, there had been nothing else to do. And if Mr Todd's was after that sort of stuff, he'd take anything. And Percy? He was out the back, polishing a car at the time, but his mind wasn't on the job. If they come for me, he was thinking, I'm not stopping here. I'm getting out. I'll go someplace. They'll have to start looking if they want to find me. They'll need bloodhounds and fast cars. They'll have to draw a cordon, and you won't catch me waiting for them. If they come for me, I'm not stopping here. He paused for a moment and straightened his back. The car that had been worked on glistened where the car that he was at work on glistened where the wash leather had been over it. It might have just come out of the showroom. But there was a hell of a lot of it still left to be done. The far side still had the spray from the hose congealing all over it. The car was American, and like most things American, it seemed a bit larger than life-size. Or suppose they come for me in a sudden, he went on suddenly. Suppose they break in when I'm having supper. Just let them try and lay hands on me. Just let them try. They'll find out. They'll learn their lesson. They'll get their fingers burnt if they come on me sudden. The hard edges of the hedgehog in his pocket were sticking into him as he bent over, and the blunt points, not so blunt either, made him feel better, safer. He started polishing again. The trouble with me, he resumed, is I think too much. I'm getting nervy. I'm seeing things. Just let them try to lay their hands on me. Just let them. And we are now at the end of that chapter, and we're going to start another chapter. But I'm going to leave it there because that was a good bit of reading. I know it was only 45 minutes, but we're going to start chapter 26, and we get into a different mode of thought. So we don't want to do that. That was cool. So there we go. Mr Josser seems to be recovering from that quick operation of drawing the fluid out of his lungs, thanks to Bill. And Mr Todd's, the lodger, isn't who he seems and has been out there, I guess, gathering evidence, because I'm assuming he's a policeman. And Percy has no idea, but Connie thinks she's got a thief in her midst and she wants to make the most of it. Blimey. I haven't seen a hedgehog since 1996, says Sean James Cameron, when he used to be down on the west end of Cardiff, no doubt, smacking people about. Sean James Cameron from the allotment channel. Poof, poof. Take that, boyo. Poof. You know how these violent Welshmen are. Oh dear, Percy, you silly young man, says Anne H. More of a child than a man, yes. I feel sorry for his poor mother. I know. Dear, oh dear. Anyway, Jen says, that was great. I was lost in the story. Fantastic. Thank you very much. Ben Reeves says, lucky my dad's pleurisy resolved itself in time. Always worried that his lungs had given him... Sorry, it's all blurred now. I've been looking close up, only got one eye to focus with. Always worried me with his lungs, given he used to strip asbestos for a job about 40 years ago. Blimey. Turbo Stream says it put him right off his tee. Oh, creton, is it? A type of fabric pronounced creton or cretan or Cretan? I can't read it, I'm afraid. Having looked at as I say, sometimes I think, I'll be blind in the end. I hope not. I do like looking out of my good eye. Anyway, there we are. No hedgehog near me, says Turbo. Michael White says, thanks, Richard. Well read. Wonderful reading. Superb. Better than the film, says Sean James Cameron. There we are. Wonderful reading. Marvellous. Thank you very much for joining me. Do join me again tomorrow. When's Daddy? And when's Daddy coming home? He's not coming home. Oh. That's what my kids say. When's Daddy coming home? He's home. He's home already. And I will catch up with you then. Look after yourselves. Have a good rest of the evening. Enjoy the sunshine if you've got it. I gather in west or east or whichever side of Scotland, they've got rain. So we're all right for a change, which is lovely. Anyway, take care. Look after yourselves. And I'll see you next time. Ta-ta for now.